The gun was already out of the holster before Rebecca Wilcox even realized she had drawn it. Her hand was steady, which surprised her, because nothing else in her body was. Her heart was slamming against her ribs like a caged animal trying to break free, and the cold November air was burning her lungs with every ragged breath she dragged in. She was standing in the middle of a snowfield that had no right existing this far south in Texas, her boots soaked through to the bone, her dark hair plastered against her cheeks, and her gun aimed directly at the silhouette of a man who had emerged from the gray morning like a ghost. He had his hands up. That was the detail that stopped her from pulling the trigger. His hands were raised, palms out, fingers spread, and he was looking at her with dark eyes that held no fear, only a careful, measured steadiness that she found more alarming than aggression would have been. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a long canvas duster that was caked with frost along the hem. His hat was pulled low against the wind. He had a rifle slung across his back, but he made no move toward it. He made no move at all. "I am not your enemy," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who had learned the hard way that shouting accomplished nothing. "You have no idea what my enemies look like," Rebecca said, and her voice cracked on the last word because it was true, because that was the whole terrible problem, because she had trusted the wrong person so completely that she no longer knew who in this world she could trust at all. "That is fair," the man said. "But I am bleeding, and there is a blizzard coming, and there is a fire in that canyon behind me. I am going to that fire whether you shoot me or not. I am just suggesting you come with me." That was how it started. But to understand what it meant, you have to go back to the beginning of that cold morning, to the hour before the sun attempted and failed to rise over the Llano Estacado, to the moment Rebecca Wilcox had climbed out of a burning wagon and run for her life across the frozen Texas plains with nothing but the clothes on her back, a loaded revolver, and a secret so dangerous that people had already died because of it. It was November of 1878, and Rebecca Wilcox was 26 years old, and she had been a fool. She had come west from Philadelphia 3 months earlier on the promise of a new life. That was how she had thought of it, a new life, like a dress you could put on and suddenly be someone different. She had been working as a telegraph operator for the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, and she had been good at it, precise and fast and reliable, and that was what had gotten her into trouble. That was what had made her valuable to the wrong people. His name was Clarence Dodd, and he had worked in the railroad's accounting office, and he had been embezzling funds for 2 years before Rebecca had decoded an anomaly in the financial wire transmissions and put the pieces together. She had not been looking for it. She had not been trying to be a hero. She had simply been doing her job, and the numbers had told her a story she had not wanted to hear. She had made a mistake. Instead of going directly to the authorities, she had confronted Clarence Dodd privately, believing in the naive goodness of her own heart that he would confess, make restitution, and allow her to maintain the quiet, careful life she had built. She had told him she knew. She had told him she had the proof encoded in a sequence of paper telegraph strips she had taken from the archive. And he had smiled at her. That smile had haunted every single mile she had traveled since then. Within a week, her apartment had been searched. Within 2 weeks, a man she did not recognize had followed her home from work. Within a month, she had received a note that said simply, in neat handwriting, "Give us the strips or we will explain to the proper authorities how you helped us steal it." So she had run. She had taken the telegraph strips, which contained irrefutable proof of a scheme that went far beyond Clarence Dodd, a scheme that reached up into the upper management of the railroad company, and possibly into the offices of men who wore badges. And she had taken the first train west because west was where a person went in 1878 when they needed to disappear. She had been heading for a small settlement called Marlow Crossing in the Texas Panhandle, where a woman named Dora Finch, her mother's old friend, had a boarding house and had offered refuge in a letter sent 3 weeks before Rebecca had made the decision to run. The plan was simple. Get to Marlow Crossing. Give the telegraph strips to Dora for safekeeping. Contact a federal marshal who operated out of Amarillo, a man named Thaddeus Prout, who reportedly took railroad corruption cases seriously and could not be bought. The plan had been simple, and it had held together for exactly 230 miles. The wagon she had hired in the town of Flint Creek had been driven by a man named Cyrus, a weather-beaten fellow of about 50 who had seemed harmless enough. He had known the route to Marlow Crossing and had quoted her a fair price, and she had been too desperate and too exhausted to be properly suspicious. But on the second morning of the journey, she had woken before dawn in the back of the wagon with the smell of smoke in her nostrils and the instinct of pure animal terror telling her to move right now. And she had moved, rolling off the wagon bed with her coat and her revolver and the small leather document pouch she wore on a strap beneath her shirt. And when she hit the frozen ground and scrambled upright and looked back, she saw the wagon was already burning from the front, and Cyrus was gone. And two riders were circling on horseback 50 yards off, dark shapes in the pre-dawn gray, watching to make sure no one climbed out alive. She had run south into the dark. She had run for 2 hours, maybe more, across ground that was flat and featureless and absolutely brutal in the November cold. The temperature had dropped to something near to lethal by the time the sky started to lighten, and she had no food and no water except what she could scrape off the frozen ground with her hands, and the blizzard that was building on the northern horizon was moving faster than anything had a right to move. And then the man had stepped out of the gray morning with his hands raised. Grant Ford had been riding south out of the Palo Duro Canyon country for 3 days. He was 30 years old, and he had a face that had been lived in hard, weathered and angular, with a jaw that carried a few days of dark stubble, and eyes the color of strong coffee that missed very little. He was not a man who talked much about himself, which suited the territory he moved through, because in 1878 in the Texas Panhandle, the men who talked too freely about their histories were usually the ones whose histories could get them killed. He had been a cattle drover for 6 years, working the long trails up from South Texas to the Kansas railheads, and before that he had done 2 years as a deputy marshal in a county that no longer existed, absorbed into a larger jurisdiction after a series of events he did not like to think about. And before that there were things he did not discuss at all, not because he was ashamed of them, though some of them warranted shame, but because they were finished and the past was the past, and a man could either live in it or live forward, and he had chosen forward. He was riding toward Marlow Crossing because he had a job waiting there. A rancher named Samuel Aldrich had sent word through a chain of intermediaries that he needed a reliable man to help manage his winter cattle operation, a legitimate offer at legitimate wages, and Grant was at a point in his life where legitimate suited him better than it once had. He had spotted the burning wagon from 2 miles off, the smoke rising black and ugly against the pale sky, and he had ridden toward it out of habit, because, whatever his history, he had never been the kind of man who rode away from trouble that involved innocent people. By the time he reached the wagon, the fire was well established and there was no one alive near it, but the tracks in the frost told him something important. One set of boot prints, small and clearly belonging to a woman running south. 2 sets of horse tracks, circling and then heading east. They had not followed her. That meant they thought she was dead, or they had somewhere else to be, or they were confident they would find her later. None of those options were good for the woman whose boot prints were now disappearing into the white distance. He had followed them. He found her 20 minutes later, and she had her gun out and she was shaking with cold and fury and something that was either terror or its very close cousin, and she was the most alive-looking person he had seen in months. He said what he said about the fire and the blizzard and the canyon, and she stared at him for a long moment with those gray-green eyes that were calculating distances and risks and trustworthiness all at once, and then she lowered the gun. She did not holster it. She lowered it. "Lead the way," she said, "and walk slow." "Yes, ma'am," Grant said and turned toward the canyon. The fire was small, but it was real, tucked into a sandstone alcove about 40 feet deep in the canyon wall, where the rock curved inward enough to break the wind completely. He had built it before dawn when he had made camp for the night, feeding it dry mesquite wood he had gathered in the last hour of the previous day's light, and it was burning steadily now with a small orange heart that pushed warmth out into the enclosed space with surprising generosity. Rebecca entered the alcove with her gun still in her hand and put her back to the canyon wall so she could see both Grant and the entrance at once. She was doing it automatically, he noticed, the way a person did things when they had been frightened often enough that caution became muscle memory. She was scanning, she was calculating, she was cold to the bone and terrified, and she was still thinking clearly, and he respected that more than he could have explained. "Sit down," he said. "The cold gets in deep when you are standing." "I am fine standing." "You are shaking so hard you are going to spill your own ammunition if that gun fires," he said, not unkindly. She looked down at her hand. She was shaking. She sat down, cross-legged on his bedroll, and kept the gun in her lap and said nothing. He crouched by the fire and fed it 2 more pieces of wood, and then he opened his saddlebag and brought out jerked beef and hardtack and a tin canteen that still had water in it that had not yet frozen, and he set them on the ground between them without comment. She watched him for a long time before she touched the food. Outside the alcove, the blizzard arrived. It came in the way blizzards come to the Texas Panhandle in November, without sufficient warning and with absolute commitment, the wind dropping to near silence for 1 full minute before it came screaming back in from the north, with snow driving horizontal, and the temperature falling fast enough to be dangerous. They could hear it in the canyon, a sustained roar that vibrated in the sandstone above their heads, but inside the alcove it was merely cold rather than deadly, and the fire held. Rebecca ate the jerked beef slowly, watching him. Grant did not push conversation. He had learned that people told you what they wanted you to know in their own time, and that pressing for information was the fastest way to ensure you got none of it. He cleaned the wound on his left forearm, which was a long, shallow cut from a piece of the burning wagon debris he had ridden too close to, and he wrapped it with a strip of cloth from his saddlebag, and he settled himself against the opposite wall of the alcove with his rifle across his knees and his hat pushed back from his forehead. "You are going to tell me your name eventually," he said. He was not asking. "Rebecca," she said after a pause. "Rebecca Wilcox, Grant Ford, who cut your arm." He looked at the wrapped forearm with mild surprise because it was not the question he had expected. "Wagon debris. Your wagon, I think." "I got close enough to look for survivors before I figured out where you had gone." Something shifted in her expression. "You followed my tracks." "I did." "Why?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because 2 riders were circling a burning wagon in the dark and a woman was running alone across frozen ground in a November blizzard. Those facts arranged themselves into a situation I did not feel right ignoring. You do not know me." "That is correct. I could be anyone. I could be a criminal." "You could be," he agreed. "So could I. People out here generally are in one way or another. The question is what kind." She was quiet for a while, watching the fire. The blizzard outside went through a particularly violent gust, and the sound was enormous, a hollow grinding roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and she flinched slightly, the involuntary response of a body that had been running scared for long enough that loud sounds had become synonymous with danger. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "Marlow Crossing." She went very still. He saw it, the way her shoulders stopped moving, the way her breathing changed, the way her eyes came up to his face with a sudden sharpened attention that had not been there a moment before. "What is in Marlow Crossing for you?" she asked, and the careful neutrality of her voice told him she was working very hard to sound casual. "A ranching job, Samuel Aldrich's spread." "Do you know a woman named Dora Finch?" He thought about it. "By name only. She runs the boarding house." Rebecca looked at the fire for a long time, and then she looked at him, and then she made a decision he could see her making, the way you can see a person choose to step off a high ledge, the moment just before the commitment becomes irreversible. "I am also going to Marlow Crossing," she said. "And I am going to tell you something that I should not tell anyone, because you are the only other person in 50 miles and there is a blizzard keeping us here, and I need you to understand what you have gotten yourself into by following my tracks." "All right," he said, and she told him. She did not tell him everything at once. It came out in pieces, the way true stories usually do, not in a clean narrative arc but in fragments that accumulated and began to fit together as the fire burned down and was fed again, and the blizzard howled its endless song outside the canyon. She told him about the telegraph strips and what they contained. She told him about Clarence Dodd and the railroad embezzlement that turned out to be more than embezzlement, a systematic fraud that had been used to fund land grabs across 3 states, pushing out homesteaders and small ranchers by corrupting the surveys, bribing county assessors, and using railroad access as leverage. She told him about the men who had followed her from Philadelphia. She told him about the burning wagon and the 2 riders. She did not tell him about the federal marshal in Amarillo. She kept that piece back, not because she distrusted him exactly, but because she had learned to travel with her most important cards held close. Grant listened without interrupting, which she had not expected from a man. The men she had known in Philadelphia either interrupted constantly or listened with the barely concealed impatience of people waiting for their turn to speak. Grant Ford listened the way a man listens when he actually wants to know what he is hearing, with his full attention settled on her face and his coffee-dark eyes tracking the details. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The strips," he said. "You still have them?" "Yes." "On you?" "Yes. That is why they burned the wagon rather than stopping it. They did not want to fight. They wanted to make it look like an accident." "An accident," Rebecca said, and the word tasted like poison. "Yes. And then they left because they think you died in the fire. Or they will be back with more men when the storm passes." He nodded slowly. "Who knows you are going to Marlow Crossing?" "No one. I told no one. I went directly from Flint Creek to Cyrus, the wagon driver, and I paid him in cash." She paused. "Although if Cyrus was working for them, then he knew where I was going." "Then we have until the storm passes before they can move." She noticed the "we." She noticed it and she did not correct it, which surprised her about herself. "Why are you using the word we?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Because you are alone in a canyon in a blizzard with people hunting you, and I am going to the same place you are going, and I have already gotten involved by following your tracks." He paused. "And because whatever those telegraph strips contain, if it is bad enough that people are burning wagons and chasing a woman across the Texas panhandle, then it is bad enough that someone needs to care about it. You do not know what you are agreeing to." "I know enough," he said. "I know that the railroad companies have been tearing this territory apart for years. I know what it looks like when big men with money decide that laws apply to other people." He shifted his weight and something in his expression changed, became more private, more contained. "I know what it looks like because I have seen it happen to people I cared about." That last sentence hung between them in the fire-lit dark of the alcove, and Rebecca felt the shape of it, the weight and history in those few words, and she understood instinctively that there was a dark past behind it that he was not ready to share, and she did not press. Outside, the blizzard intensified. They fed the fire and they talked, and the hours of being trapped together in that small, warm space began to do what enforced proximity always does to human beings, begin to dissolve the distance that strangers maintain out of habit and social convention. Rebecca found herself telling him things she had not intended to say, not the secret of the telegraph strips, but other things, the shape of her life in Philadelphia, the satisfaction she had found in the precision of telegraph work, the way she had felt genuinely free in the clicking language of dots and dashes, the way Morse code had felt like a secret language that belonged entirely to her. Grant told her about the cattle trails, the long solitary days on horseback moving north through the Kansas grasslands, the particular quality of light on the plains at dawn, the way the herd moved as a single living thing when it was going well. He told her about a horse named Cannon that he had ridden for 4 years and lost to a rattlesnake bite in the spring, and the grief in his voice when he said it was entirely unguarded, the honest grief of a man who has lost a companion, and it made Rebecca trust him in a way that no amount of reasonable behavior could have accomplished. She trusted him because he grieved honestly for a horse. The blizzard blew itself out toward midday, the roaring gradually subsiding to a gusting moan and then to a cold and brilliant silence, and when Grant went to the entrance of the alcove and looked out, the world had been remade in white and blue, the canyon walls gleaming with ice, the sky above a hard, flawless azure that had no mercy in it. "We need to move," he said, "before dark finds us in the open." His horse, a big gray gelding named Soldier, had spent the blizzard in a narrow side canyon 10 yards from the alcove, partially sheltered and perfectly miserable. Grant checked him over carefully, running his hands along the horse's legs and checking his hooves before he was satisfied, and then he looked at Rebecca. "You ride?" he asked. "I can manage. Soldier is 15 hands and strong-willed. Can you manage that specifically?" She gave him a look that communicated clearly that she was not a woman who required her capabilities to be mapped for her, and he had the grace to look slightly abashed, and that made her feel something warm toward him that she immediately told herself was simply relief at not being alone. They rode together, Rebecca up behind Grant on Soldier, and the horse was indeed strong-willed but tolerated the double weight with dignified resignation. The snow was 8 inches deep on the flat and deeper where it had drifted, and the going was slow, but the sky was clear and the sun, pale and distant in the November sky, provided enough light to navigate by. Rebecca's arms were around Grant's waist, and she was acutely aware of the warmth of him against the cold air, the solidity of him, the way he sat the horse with the kind of natural ease that spoke of 1,000 miles in the saddle. She was also acutely aware that she had known him for approximately 6 hours and had told him her most dangerous secret, and was now riding through the snowy Texas panhandle with her arms around him, and all of this was so far outside the boundaries of her previous life that it might as well be happening to someone else. "How far to Marlow Crossing?" she asked, her voice close to his ear. 14 miles if I have the canyon right," he said. "We can make it before dark. What do you know about it?" The town, small, maybe 200 people, not counting the ranches outside. Railroad spur line was supposed to come through last year, but it got redirected. That hurt a lot of businesses. "Redirected," Rebecca said, and felt the word settle into the larger pattern of what she knew. "Do you know why?" Official story was cost of construction. Actual story, from what I heard in Flint Creek, was that a land company from back east bought up the land north of town and convinced the railroad to swing the line past their property instead. "A land company," Rebecca said. She thought about the telegraph strips inside their leather pouch against her chest. She thought about the names encoded in those strips. She thought about how far this went and how many places it reached, and she felt a cold that had nothing to do with the November air. "Grant," she said. "The railroad company this is about. It is the Southern Plains Railroad." He was quiet for a moment. "That is the company that was supposed to bring the spur to Marlow Crossing." "Yes," she said. He did not say anything for a while after that, and they rode through the white silence of the frozen plains, and Rebecca could feel the shift in him, the way he was restructuring what he knew against this new information, and she let him do it because it was the kind of thinking that needed space. "The land north of town," he said finally. "Samuel Aldrich's land is north of town. You think he is involved?" "I do not know what I think yet," Grant said. "But I think the job offer I received deserves some additional consideration." The implications of that settled over them both like the cold, and they rode on. Marlow Crossing appeared in the late afternoon, a scatter of wooden buildings in a shallow valley, smoke rising from chimneys, a main street that ran 4 blocks before giving way to frozen dirt and scrub grass. It looked like exactly what it was. A small settlement trying to build itself into something more permanent. Businesses and homes in various states of completion. The whole enterprise fragile and determined in the way that frontier towns always were. They rode in along the main street and drew looks, which was unavoidable since they were two people on one horse, and both of them were covered in trail dust and melted snow, and the general disreputable appearance of people who had recently survived something they had not anticipated. Grant rode directly to the livery stable at the east end of the street and arranged for soldiers' board, and then they stood in the brittle November air and Rebecca looked at the town she had been trying to reach for days, and she felt simultaneously relieved to have arrived and deeply uneasy about what arriving meant. "Dora Finch's boarding house," she said. "Down the main street, left side, white building with green shutters. I passed through here once 2 years ago, I remember it." "Come with me," she said. It was not quite a question and not quite a command. He looked at her with those steady dark eyes and nodded once. Dora Finch was a woman of about 60, stout and sharp-eyed, with the particular quality of alertness that belongs to people who have run a boarding house for a long time, and consequently have learned to read arrivals the way other people read weather. She opened the door to their knock, and her eyes went from Rebecca to Grant and back to Rebecca, and then she said, "You must be Margaret's daughter," which was how Rebecca knew she was safe, because that was the code phrase she and Dora had agreed upon in their correspondence. "I am," Rebecca said. "Dora, I need to speak with you privately." "Both of you come inside," Dora said, and stood back, and they went in. The boarding house was warm and smelled of baking bread and wood smoke, and there were 3 other guests in the front parlor who looked up with the mild curiosity of people who have nothing better to do on a cold afternoon. And Dora led Rebecca and Grant through to the kitchen at the back, a large practical room with a wood-burning stove and a long table, and the kind of organized clutter that suggested constant useful activity. "Sit," Dora said, and put a coffee pot on the stove, and then she looked at Rebecca with full attention. "You look like you ran all the way from Philadelphia." "I ran most of the last 2 days," Rebecca said. "There was a fire." She gave Dora the condensed version, watching the older woman's face, which remained composed and attentive throughout. Grant sat at the end of the table with his hands around a coffee cup and listened and did not speak. When Rebecca finished, Dora was quiet for a moment. "Thaddeus Prout," she said then. "You still mean to contact him?" "He is in Amarillo, yes." "He was," Dora said. "He came through here 10 days ago on his way south. He was headed for San Angelo, some trouble with land claims down there. He will be back through in, I would say, 2 to 3 weeks." 2 to 3 weeks. Rebecca absorbed this. "Is there a way to get word to him sooner?" "Telegraph office down the street." "Though I would not send those strips by wire." "No," Rebecca agreed. "Not the strips, just a message. The telegraph operator is a young man named Willis. He is trustworthy as far as I know, but these are small towns, Rebecca. People talk. If someone with money and connections is looking for you and sends the right inquiries, word travels. Then we need to be careful about how long we are visible." "You can stay here," Dora said. "That is not an issue. I have 2 rooms available." Her eyes went briefly to Grant. "You are Mr. Ford." "Yes, ma'am." "Rebecca trusts you. That is a high bar, I assure you." She looked back at Rebecca. "There is something else you should know. A man came through 3 days ago asking about travelers from the East. He specifically asked about a woman traveling alone. He said he was a cousin looking for a missing relative." Rebecca felt the cold again. "What did he look like?" Dora described him. "A slim man in a city-cut coat, clean-shaven, about 40 years old, with pale blue eyes and a way of smiling that did not reach them." "Did he stay?" "1 night. He left south." But there was another man asking similar questions at the dry goods store 2 days ago. Different man entirely. They were already here. They were already in Marlow Crossing, or had been, circling in, waiting. Rebecca's hand moved without thinking to the leather pouch beneath her shirt, the physical reassurance of the telegraph strip still there, still safe. Grant spoke for the first time since they had entered the kitchen. "Dora," he said. "You received a letter some weeks ago from a woman in Philadelphia asking about shelter for a traveler in some trouble. Did anyone else know about that letter?" Dora's eyes sharpened. "My mail is my own business." "I am not doubting your discretion," he said, with a patience that Rebecca was coming to recognize as characteristic. "I am asking about who might have intercepted it at the source. If the men who are hunting Rebecca have access to the railroad's telegraph and mail routes, they could have known she was coming here before she even left Philadelphia." The room was very quiet for a moment. "Then this was always a trap," Rebecca said, hearing her own voice as if from a distance. "Not necessarily," Grant said. "If it were a trap, they would have let her arrive and then moved in rather than trying to burn her in the wagon 50 miles out. They may have known her destination but not her exact route or timing. Burning the wagon was opportunistic, not coordinated." "That is either reassuring or it is not," Rebecca said. "It means we are not walking into a fully planned ambush. It means they are improvising, which is better." "How is it better?" "Because improvising people make mistakes," he said simply. That night in the room Dora had given her, Rebecca sat on the edge of the narrow bed with the leather pouch in her hands and the lamp burning low on the nightstand, and she thought about Grant Ford with a focus and clarity that she could not entirely account for by logic. She had known him for less than a day. She had met him at gunpoint in a snowfield. She had no more reason to trust him than she had to trust the frozen ground she had been running across that morning. And yet she kept returning to the details. The way he had kept his hands raised without flinching. The way he had followed her tracks and never once made her feel like a burden or an obligation. The way he had listened to her story with full attention and then immediately begun thinking about how to help rather than whether to help. The way he had grieved for a horse and let her see it. She also thought about the job offer from Samuel Aldrich, and the redirected railroad spur, and the land company from back east, and the way all of those threads seemed to be weaving themselves toward the same dark center. If Aldrich was connected to the Southern Plains Railroad fraud, then Grant's job offer might not be innocent. It might be intended to bring a reliable and capable man to Marlow Crossing for reasons that had nothing to do with cattle. She needed to tell him this. She needed to tell him that she thought he might have been brought here as deliberately as she had, just through a different door. There was a knock at her door, soft, 2 taps. She took the revolver from the bedside table before she said, "Who is it?" "Ford," he said from the other side of the door. "I need to talk to you." She opened the door. He was still dressed, his hat off, his dark hair slightly ruffled, and his expression carried something she had not seen in it before, a controlled urgency that told her he had learned something. "I went down to the saloon," he said, "to listen. And Samuel Aldrich was there. He recognized me from a description, apparently, because he came directly over and introduced himself, very friendly, bought me a drink." He paused, and then he asked me casually whether I had happened to see any other travelers on the road coming in. "He was looking for me. He was looking for a woman traveling alone from the east." "Yes." "Grant," she said carefully, "I think your job offer and my destination are part of the same design. I think someone sent you here to be useful to them in Marlow Crossing, the same way someone sent men to intercept me." "I know," he said. "I came to the same conclusion in the last hour." He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe and the lamplight fell across his face, and he looked tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. "I received the job offer through a man named Harlan Dwyer in Flint Creek. Harlan is a broker. He connects workers with ranches. I have used him before, but I never asked who referred the Aldrich job to Harlan. I just took it. Someone wanted a capable man, possibly a man with some law enforcement background in this town at this time." He looked at her steadily. "How did you know about the law enforcement background?" "The way you think," she said. "The way you assess the wagon tracks, the way you think about motive and opportunity. You are not just a drover." He was quiet for a moment. "I was a deputy marshal for 2 years, Haskell County, before it was absorbed." And then, a pause, then, And then I made a mistake, a significant one with lasting consequences, and I resigned before I was asked to leave." He did not elaborate and she did not push, and they stood in that small moment of mutual incomplete disclosure, two people who had both made mistakes and run from them in different directions and arrived at the same fire on the same cold morning, and there was something so oddly fitting about it that Rebecca felt it in her chest like a struck chord. "What do we do about Aldrich?" she asked. "I go to work," Grant said. "I show up at his ranch tomorrow as expected, and I keep my ears open. If he is connected to the fraud in those telegraph strips, the best thing I can do is get close enough to learn what he knows and what his next move is. That is dangerous." "Yes," he agreed. "But the alternative is waiting in this boarding house for 2 or 3 weeks for Prout to come back through, during which time Aldrich will figure out you are here and come for the strips. And if Aldrich figures out you are working against him," Grant looked at her with those steady dark eyes, "then I will need you to be ready to move fast." She met his gaze and held it for a 3 count, and then she said, "I can do that." He nodded and started to turn away and then stopped. He turned back. "Rebecca," he said, and her name in his mouth had a weight she had not expected, not formal, not casual, but careful, as if he were aware of its value. "I want you to know that I am not here because someone sent me to be useful to them. Whatever that original intention was, it is not mine. I am here because the right thing is the right thing, and it does not stop being the right thing because the situation is complicated. I need you to know that." She looked at him for a long time. The lamplight made the room feel smaller and warmer than it was. "I know," she said, and she meant it. The next 2 days settled into a careful rhythm. Grant rode out to the Aldrich Ranch each morning and returned in the evenings, and Rebecca spent her days at Dora's boarding house, keeping a low profile, helping Dora with the housework in exchange for the reduced rate that kept the financial arrangement manageable. She was not idle. She was thinking constantly, working through the contents of the telegraph strips in her head, mapping the connections, writing down what she knew in a small notebook that she kept with the strips in the leather pouch. The Southern Plains Railroad fraud was more extensive than she had initially understood. The telegraph transmissions she had decoded included correspondence between the railroad's upper management and a network of land agents and county officials across 3 states, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado. The core of the scheme was elegant in its ugliness. The railroad would announce a proposed route, driving up land values along the projected line. Land agents connected to the scheme would buy up cheap land in the projected corridor. Then the route would be officially changed, ostensibly for engineering or cost reasons, to pass instead through land owned by the same agents, making their holdings enormously valuable while devastating the original corridor landowners who had invested everything in the expected connection. Marlow Crossing had been one of those devastated towns, and Samuel Aldrich, she was increasingly certain, was one of the land agents. Which meant that the telegraph strips in her leather pouch were not just evidence of an accounting fraud. They were evidence of organized criminal conspiracy that had genuinely destroyed lives, bankrupted homesteaders, collapsed local economies, and quite possibly contributed to the violence and displacement that had been reverberating through these territories for years. On the evening of the 3rd day, Grant came back looking different. She was sitting in the kitchen with Dora when she heard the front door and then his boots on the wooden floor, and when he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his jaw was tight and his eyes held a brightness that was not excitement but something closer to controlled anger. "I need to speak with Rebecca," he said to Dora. He was entirely polite, but Dora read him the way she read everyone and stood immediately and said she needed to check on something in the parlor. Grant sat down across from Rebecca. "Aldrich has a man watching this building," he said. "I saw him on my way in. He is sitting in the alley between the hardware store and the dry goods, wrapped in a coat, on a horse that he has been there long enough to get bored with. He is watching the front door." Rebecca felt the familiar cold. How long? Judging by the horse's impatience, at least 4 hours. He leaned forward on his elbows. "Aldrich asked me today about the woman I came in with. He phrased it as casual curiosity. He said someone mentioned I had ridden in on a shared horse with a woman. He knows I am here. He suspects. He does not know your name yet, I think, but he will figure it out. Then we are out of time. Not completely, Grant said. I found something today in Aldrich's office while he was out of the building dealing with a fence dispute. I had 3 minutes and I used them. He reached into his coat and produced a folded letter, and he placed it on the table between them. Rebecca unfolded it carefully. It was a letter from a man whose name appeared at the top in bold script, Edmund Hargrove, which was the name she recognized from one of the most incriminating telegraph transmissions in her pouch. Hargrove was the Eastern Land Company director, the man at the top of the entire scheme. The letter was dated 6 weeks ago, and it was addressed to Aldrich, and it said in careful, businessman's language that the situation with the telegraph operator had been resolved to his satisfaction, but that confirmation of the finalization would require physical verification, which Aldrich was to arrange upon her arrival in his territory. Physical verification of finalization. They are not trying to get the strips back, Rebecca said, hearing the flatness of her own voice. They are trying to make sure I cannot testify. Yes, Grant said. She folded the letter back up and pushed it across the table to him. Her hands were steady. She was enormously proud of this. I need to get a message to Prout in San Angelo, she said, and I need to get it there faster than 2 to 3 weeks. There is a man in town named Pete Garrett who rides dispatch for the county. He can get a letter to San Angelo in 4 days if the weather holds. Dora knows him. And in the meantime, Grant looked at her directly. In the meantime, we do not do anything that signals panic because panic makes people who are watching you make their move. We stay visible but careful, we act normal, and we wait. Staying visible means they see me. It means they see you and believe you do not know you are being watched. That is different. He paused. Can you do that? She thought about it. Yes, she said. It was perhaps the hardest thing she had ever said yes to. Dora arranged the letter to Pete Garrett with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been quietly efficient in difficult circumstances for 40 years. The letter went out the next morning, a carefully worded message requesting the urgent assistance of Federal Marshal Thaddeus Prout in a matter of significant criminal importance, including a description of the evidence in Rebecca's possession and the names of the principal actors. And then they waited. The days that followed were a peculiar combination of mundane and terrifying, a slow unspooling of ordinary time beneath which ran a current of danger that never stopped moving. Grant rode to the Aldrich ranch each morning and reported back each evening, and every day he brought back another piece of the picture, a name, a transaction, a conversation overheard in the bunkhouse. Aldrich was expecting someone from the east, a man coming to ensure the situation was resolved. He was expected before the end of the month. Before the end of the month was 8 days away. Rebecca kept to Dora's boarding house during the days, but in the evenings she and Grant fell into the habit of sitting by the kitchen stove after dinner, and they talked for hours, and she learned about him in the way you learn about a person when there is time and trust and warmth, in long accumulated detail that builds a portrait. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a blacksmith father and a schoolteacher mother. The schoolteacher had given him books and the habit of reading, which was unusual for a man in his circumstances, and which had shaped the way he thought, methodically, from evidence, with attention to cause and consequence. The blacksmith had given him endurance, and the ability to work with his hands and the bedrock certainty that honest work done honestly was the only foundation a life could stand on. He had gone west at 22, as so many men had, following the cattle trade and the restless need for space that the crowded towns of Missouri could not satisfy. He had become a deputy marshal not because of any burning desire for law enforcement, but because the county sheriff at the time had recognized something in him and asked, and he had been at a point in his life where being asked to do something useful felt like grace. The mistake he had alluded to, he told her about on the 4th evening. He had been protecting a witness in a murder case, a young woman named Clara who had seen a wealthy cattleman named Jessup shoot his ranch foreman in a dispute over wages. Jessup had the money to buy influence, and the trial had been moving toward dismissal on procedural grounds that Grant had been certain were invented. He had decided on his own authority to move Clara to a safer location before a scheduled hearing, without informing the sheriff, and during the move, Jessup's men had intercepted them. Clara had escaped unharmed, which had been his primary objective, and he had achieved it. But he had broken multiple protocols, had used force beyond what was strictly authorized, and had ultimately ensured that Jessup's lawyers were able to argue procedural misconduct and get the charges thrown out entirely. Clara had been safe, Jessup had walked free, and Grant had resigned his badge with the understanding that his continued presence in the department would be used by Jessup's lawyers against any future charges. "So you saved her and lost the case," Rebecca said quietly. "Yes. You have been living with that. Every day," he said. "I know what the right choice was, I made it, and I know what the cost was. I have never been able to decide which mattered more." "They both matter," Rebecca said. "Clara matters. The case mattered. You cannot put them on a scale." He looked at her for a long time. The stove was warm and the kitchen was quiet, and outside the window the November dark was complete and cold. "You are the first person who has said that to me," he said, "who I actually believed." She felt the warmth of it move through her, and she looked away at the stove because looking at him directly in that moment felt like too much, felt like standing too close to the fire. But she was aware, with the clarity of a person who has been alone long enough to know their own heart, that she was falling for Grant Ford with the same helpless and perfectly logical inevitability with which the snow falls in November. She was not trying to. She would not have chosen it, not here, not now, not in the middle of everything. But it was happening, quietly and completely, like the fire burning down in the small hours, steady and warm and entirely without her permission. On the 6th day, the man from the east arrived. She did not see him arrive. Grant told her about it that evening, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone presenting information they would rather not possess. His name was Leon Briggs, and he had come in on the afternoon stage, and he was the slim man with pale blue eyes and the smile that did not reach them that Dora had described. The same man who had been in town 3 days before Rebecca arrived and asked about women traveling alone. He was not just an agent of Hargrove's Land Company. Grant had heard his name before. He had heard it in the context of men who solved problems that could not be solved through legitimate means. Leon Briggs was, in the parlance of the time and place, a fixer, a man who made inconvenient situations and inconvenient people disappear. "He cannot do anything in public," Grant said. "He cannot risk the attention." "He does not need to do it in public," Rebecca said. The wagon was not public. The 2 riders circling at dawn were not public. He does not know exactly where you are. It will not take him long to figure it out. There are only 3 places women stay in this town, and he will start with the boarding houses. She was thinking fast now, past the fear and into the cold, practical territory beyond it. "We need to change the timeline. We cannot wait for Prout. Pete Garrett rode out 4 days ago. The letter should be in San Angelo by now, maybe delivered tomorrow. Prout could ride in 6 to 8 days if he moves fast." "That is too long." "I know," he said. "We need to approach someone local, a county official, a sheriff. The Marlow Crossing town marshal is a man named Hicks. He is decent, but he has no jurisdiction over federal crimes and no ability to hold someone like Briggs without hard evidence." "I have hard evidence. You have telegraph strips that require a trained telegraph operator to decode, in a town where the only telegraph office is a one-room operation run by a 20-year-old. Briggs's lawyers would have them dismissed before Hicks could get them entered into a formal complaint." She stood up and walked to the window. The main street outside was dark and cold, lamps burning in a few windows, the winter silence of a small town after 9 in the evening. She could not see the alley where Aldrich's watcher had been, but she knew he was probably still there somewhere. Then we make Briggs make his move, she said. Grant was quiet. We make him think he has an opportunity, she said. We create one, a situation where he believes he can act quickly and quietly, and when he does, we have witnesses. That requires you to be the bait. Yes, she said. No, he said. She turned from the window. Grant. No, he said again, and his voice had a certainty in it that was not commanding but was entirely unmovable, the voice of a man who had thought something through completely. I am not going to put you in physical danger as a deliberate tactic. You do not have that authority. You are right that I do not. He stood up, and they were a few feet apart in the kitchen, and the air between them had changed in the way air changes when two people have been carefully maintaining a distance and are suddenly unsure of it. But I am asking you not to, because whatever happens to the telegraph strips and to Hargrove and to Briggs and to all of it, you are not a means to an end. You are not bait. You are a person, and your life is not a tool. She stared at him. Her chest ached with something that she could not name cleanly. That is an extraordinary thing to say to someone you have known for 6 days, she said. It is true regardless of how long I have known you, he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere in the house a clock ticked. The stove shifted and settled. Then what do we do? She asked. We do this differently, he said. We go to Hicks tomorrow. We do not give him the strips. We tell him we have reason to believe a man named Leon Briggs is in town for a criminal purpose, and we ask him to watch Briggs specifically for any suspicious activities. Then we telegraph Willis to send a second message to Prout, more urgent. And tonight I go to see Aldrich. You go to see Aldrich. I go to see Aldrich, and I tell him that I know what the job offer was actually for. I tell him I know about Hargrove's letter. And I tell him that his name is one of the names in the evidence I am protecting, and that his best option at this point is to cooperate with the federal marshal when he arrives rather than to compound his role in this. Rebecca was silent for a moment. He could have you shot. He could, Grant said. But Aldrich is a man who has committed financial crimes and used bad men to do his dirty work. He is not, I think, a man who has the character to order violence himself when he is looking at it directly. You are gambling on his character. Yes, Grant said simply. She looked at him for a long time in the lamplight. Be careful, she said, and the two words carried more weight than she had intended, and she let them. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he said, I will. He was gone for 3 hours. She sat in the kitchen and tried to read and could not, and Dora sat across from her with her knitting and did not pretend to be unconcerned, and the clock ticked, and the stove burned, and the November night pressed cold against the windows. When she heard his horse in the alley and then his boots on the back step, she was at the door before he knocked. He came in and sat down heavily in the kitchen chair, and there was a bruise forming along his jaw that had not been there when he left. He did not have you shot, Rebecca said. He had me hit, Grant said, with a dry note that was clearly an attempt to be wry about it and was only partially successful given the bruise. By a man with large fists, but he listened. And he is frightened, Grant said. He is a man who got into something that felt manageable when he was only moving money around and filling ledgers, and it has escalated beyond anything he was prepared to handle. He did not expect murder attempts. He did not expect Leon Briggs. What did he say? He said he would cooperate with the federal marshal. He said he would provide documentation from his end of the correspondence. Grant paused. He also said that Briggs is not here just for you. He is here because Hargrove has decided that Aldrich himself has become a liability. He knows too much and he is too frightened to be reliable. The implications settled over them both. Briggs is here to clean up everything, Rebecca said. Yes, which means Aldrich is also in danger. Yes, and Aldrich just cooperated with you. Yes, she thought about this. We need to move tonight. We need to get to Marshal Hicks tonight with Aldrich with whatever documentation he has. I know, Grant said. They went to Hicks that night. They went in a group. Rebecca, Grant, Dora, and Samuel Aldrich himself, who arrived at Dora's back door 20 minutes after Grant sent him word, visibly frightened and carrying a leather valise full of correspondence that, combined with Rebecca's telegraph strips, constituted as complete a body of evidence as any federal prosecutor could wish for. Town Marshal Hicks was a compact, gray-haired man with a plain-spoken directness that Rebecca found immediately reassuring. He listened to the entire account without interruption, examined the documents Aldrich produced, allowed Rebecca to explain the telegraph strips in enough detail to understand their significance, and then he sat back in his chair and said, with the manner of a man summarizing a situation that is bad but manageable, that they needed to get Leon Briggs in a jail cell before morning. "On what charge?" Grant asked. "Suspicion of criminal conspiracy, which I can sustain for 36 hours without needing hard evidence of a specific local crime. If the federal marshal arrives in that window, we are fine. If he does not, we may have a problem." He looked at Grant. "How fast can Prout move?" "He received the message yesterday and rode immediately 4 days. Can he ride in 2? "Not from San Angelo on a horse," Grant said, "but there is a telegraph at the San Angelo railway station. If we can get a message to him there, he can take the train to Abilene and ride in from the northwest. 2 days is possible." "Then we need to send that telegraph right now," Hicks said, and looked at the clock on his wall, which read 11:30. "Willis opens the office at 6 in the morning." "Willis's house is 2 blocks from here," Dora said calmly, from the corner where she had been sitting without anyone asking her to stay, because Dora Finch was not a woman who left before things were resolved. "I can wake him." Hicks looked at her. "Do that." By 1 in the morning, the urgent telegraph to Prout had been sent. By 2, Leon Briggs was in the Marlow Crossing jail, arrested by Hicks and his single deputy on suspicion of criminal conspiracy, with the specific charge of being an identified agent of a man whose correspondence with a local landowner had been entered into evidence. Briggs had been calm about the arrest in the way that dangerous men are calm, because they know that their situation is temporary and that powerful people will move to resolve it. But they needed to move faster than powerful people. The next 36 hours were the longest of Rebecca Wilcox's life. She stayed at Dora's boarding house, and she did not sleep in any sustained way. Grant stayed too, sleeping in the chair in the front parlor with his rifle across his knees, because Briggs's arrest would be known by morning and Hargrove had other agents, and the situation was not resolved yet. On the afternoon of the second day, with Hicks staring down the approaching end of his legal authority to hold Briggs without federal support, a rider came in from the northwest. Then another rider. Then, behind them, a man on a tall bay horse who rode with the economical authority of someone who had been on horseback every day for most of his adult life. He was a heavy-set man of about 50, with a weathered face and a federal marshal's badge that caught the November light. Thaddeus Prout had ridden hard for 40 hours, changing horses twice. He took Rebecca's account, Grant's account, Aldrich's documents, and the telegraph strips in a 3-hour meeting at Hicks's office that Rebecca would later describe as the most efficient exercise of legal authority she had ever witnessed, because Prout moved through information the way a good telegraph operator moves through a message, fast and accurate and missing nothing. Briggs was formally charged that evening with conspiracy to commit murder, among other things. The warrants for Edmund Hargrove and the network of railroad officials named in the telegraph strips were drafted and dispatched within the week. Samuel Aldrich, who had cooperated fully, received a reduced charge and the understanding that his testimony would be required in what was clearly going to be a very large federal trial. The Southern Plains Railroad case, as it came to be called in the Amarillo newspapers, would take 2 years to fully prosecute, would result in the conviction of 14 men including Hargrove, and would eventually result in reparations for several of the communities, including Marlow Crossing, that had been damaged by the fraudulent route changes. But that was in the future, and on the evening of that second day, when Prout had Briggs formally in federal custody and the immediate danger had passed, Rebecca stood in Dora's kitchen and felt the tension she had been carrying for months slowly begin to let go. The careful, watchful lockdown readiness that had been her constant state for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. Dora handed her a cup of tea and said nothing, because Dora understood that some moments needed to exist before they could be spoken about. Grant found her an hour later standing on the back porch of the boarding house in the cold evening air, watching the last of the November light leave the sky. She heard the door open behind her and heard his step and did not turn. He stood beside her. They were quiet for a long time. "What happens now?" he asked. She had been thinking about this. "Prute needs me to stay through the preliminary hearings. That will be several weeks, possibly through December." She paused. "And the ranching job is no longer what it appeared to be." "The ranching job is most certainly no longer what it appeared to be," he agreed, with the dry note she had come to love. She turned to look at him, and the fading light fell across his face, and she thought about a cold morning in November and a fire in a sandstone canyon and two strangers who had shared that fire and one terrible secret, and how much had changed in the space of days in the way that nothing changes for years and then everything changes at once. "Stay," she said. It came out simpler than she had intended and truer for it. "Stay in Marlow Crossing, at least through the hearings." He looked at her. The dark evening was setting in around them, and the air was cold, and the town behind them was small and alive with lamplight, and the ordinary sounds of people living their lives. "I had thought," he said carefully, "that I might stay regardless, if that would be welcome." "It would be welcome," she said. He reached out and took her hand where it rested on the porch railing, and he covered it with his, and neither of them spoke, and the evening settled around them, cold and clear and full of the particular quality of air that exists after a great tension has broken, the specific relief of survived danger, of still being alive and standing next to someone you did not expect to find and cannot now imagine doing without. She turned her hand over under his and laced her fingers through his fingers. The first real snow of winter began to fall. December in Marlow Crossing was cold in a clean, consistent way that had none of the vicious surprise of the November blizzard, and all of the quiet beauty that snow brings to a flat landscape, softening the harsh angles of wooden buildings and making the distance between the town and the horizon look like something painted by a careful hand. Rebecca had expected to find the weeks of waiting difficult, and she found instead that they were not, because she had something she had not had in months, something that felt like safety, not the absence of danger. The danger was still out there in various legal forms, but the specific safety of being known by someone who chose to remain knowing you. Grant had taken a room at Dora's boarding house, which Dora had arranged at a rate that suggested she approved of the situation, and he had found work helping a local blacksmith and doing odd jobs around the town while they waited for the legal process to take its course. He was good with his hands and reliable and careful, and Marlow Crossing was a town that needed all three of those things, and within 2 weeks of his being there, people knew him by name and treated him with the comfortable familiarity that small communities extend to people they have decided are theirs. Rebecca watched this with a warmth in her chest that she no longer pretended to herself was anything other than what it was. She helped Willis at the telegraph office in the mornings, because Prute had asked her to stay available for consultation, and because the young telegraph operator was genuinely overwhelmed with the volume of federal communication the case was generating. She was good at it, quick and precise, and Willis was grateful and a little in awe, and she found herself falling back into the pleasure of the work, the satisfying exactness of coded language, the particular joy of a message sent and received cleanly. One afternoon in mid-December, she was at the telegraph office when a transmission came in from Philadelphia. It was not from anyone dangerous. It was from her former supervisor at the Pennsylvania Railroad, a man named Henderson who had apparently been cleared of any involvement in the fraud and had been following the case through the newspapers. The message said simply, "We had no idea. We are grateful. Come back if you want your job." She sat with that message for a long time. Grant was at the blacksmith's when she walked in at the end of the day, and the orange light of the forge was warm, and he was working at the anvil with his coat off and his sleeves rolled, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who is always glad to see a particular person and has stopped trying to keep that gladness off his face. "I heard from Philadelphia," she said. He set down the work he had been doing and wiped his hands. "Good news or bad? My old job is available. Henderson says I can come back." He was quiet for a moment. His face was composed and careful, and she could see him working to keep it that way. "That is your decision," he said. "Whatever you need to do." "I know it is my decision," she said. "I am telling you about it, not asking your permission." "I know," he said. "I am also telling you," she said, "that I have been sitting with that message for an hour, and the thought of going back to Philadelphia does not produce any feeling that resembles wanting to go." Something shifted in his face, very slightly, but she had learned to read him. "What does it produce?" he asked. "A feeling that everything I would be going back to is considerably less than what I am standing next to," she said, and she felt her face go warm saying it. But she said it because it was true, and she had learned in the past month what happened to true things that were left unsaid. Grant crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and took her face in his hands, gently, in the way of a man who is aware of his own strength, and he looked at her for one deliberate moment, and then he kissed her, and it was not impulsive or careless. It was the kiss of a man who had been thinking about it for a long time and was certain of every aspect of it, warm and careful and entirely complete. She kissed him back with everything she had been holding close since a cold morning in a sandstone canyon, when he had stood in the snow with his hands raised, and told her calmly that he was not her enemy. The preliminary hearings took place in January of 1879, in a temporarily commandeered room at the Marlow Crossing courthouse that was too small for the number of people who wanted to attend, and whose windows were frosted every morning in patterns that Rebecca found beautiful with the particular beauty of things that are both cold and intricate. She testified for 2 days, presenting the telegraph strips with Willis beside her to confirm the technical decoding, and she was steady and precise and clear. And Prout told her afterward that she had given the most organized and comprehensible technical testimony he had heard in 20 years of federal cases. Aldrich cooperated fully, and his testimony tied together the network of agents in ways that the documentary evidence alone could not accomplish. The case went to the federal court in Amarillo for trial in the spring. Between January and spring, a number of things happened in Marlow Crossing that had nothing to do with legal proceedings. Rebecca and Grant began building a life together with the same practical thoroughness they had applied to the immediate crisis. And in this, as in the crisis, they found that they were genuinely good at being alongside each other, that their particular temperaments, her precision and his patience, her directness and his steadiness, fit together in the way that complementary things do, not by being identical but by covering what the other lacked. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday afternoon in February, in the kitchen of Dora's boarding house, which was not a particularly grand setting, but was the setting where they had first been honest with each other, and she felt that was exactly right. He had a ring that he had bought from the town jeweler, a modest gold band with a small garnet that caught the light and turned it red warm, and he asked her with the directness that was characteristic of everything he did, clearly and without preamble, looking at her steadily, and saying that he loved her and wanted to spend his life standing next to her, and that he was not uncertain about any part of this. She said yes with the same directness. Dora cried and tried to pretend she was not. They were married in March, in the small white church on the east side of Marlow Crossing, by a Methodist minister named Reverend Aldgate, who had the useful quality of being pleased by unexpected things. Dora stood for Rebecca. A man named Porter, who was the blacksmith Grant had been working for, stood for Grant. There were a dozen other people in the pews because small towns are built on the accumulation of connections, and Grant and Rebecca had accumulated more of them in the months since November than either of them had expected. The ceremony was brief, and the vows were traditional, and Rebecca's voice did not waver when she said the words. And when she looked at Grant across the 2 feet of church aisle that separated them, she saw in his face something she had only seen glimpses of before, the full, unguarded version of him, the man behind all the careful steadiness, the man who had been alone long enough and was done with it. She thought about the cold morning and the fire in the canyon and the secret she had told him, and she thought that she would have chosen all of it exactly as it had happened, every frightening mile of it, because it had led here. They took the room at the back of Dora's boarding house initially, the one with the window that looked north over the open range, and Grant continued working for Porter the blacksmith while they decided what the next shape of their lives would take. Rebecca continued at the telegraph office, which Pruitt had quietly arranged to make a semi-official position, because the federal case still had active communication needs, and she was the most qualified operator in the territory. In April, a piece of land came available 3 miles north of town, 40 acres with a small creek, and the remains of a previous homestead that had been abandoned during the difficult years following the railroad fraud. The house was in poor condition, but the land was sound and the creek reliable, and the price was within what they could manage with what they had saved. They bought it together, both names on the deed, which the county assessor noted was not the usual arrangement, and which Grant said, to the assessor's face, was the only arrangement that made sense for 2 people who had both contributed to making it possible. They spent the spring and summer repairing the house, and it was a particular kind of happiness that comes from building something with your hands alongside someone you love, the satisfaction of walls made sound and floors made level, and a roof that held against the summer rains that came rolling up from the south in long blue curtains that turned the prairie silver for hours at a time. The Southern Plains Railroad trial concluded in August of 1879, with convictions on the major counts for 12 of the 14 defendants, including Edmund Hargrove, who received a 7-year sentence. The 2 who were acquitted were minor figures whose roles could not be proven beyond reasonable doubt, and Pruitt told Rebecca privately that he thought the jury had gotten it approximately right. The reparations process began the following year, and Marlow Crossing was assessed a credit against the fraudulent land seizures that went some way toward rebuilding what had been taken, and the town used it to bring a proper telegraph line and a negotiated spur line, and the year after that, the first real business expansion began. Rebecca watched all of it from the telegraph office, and from her front porch, and from the fields of her own 40 acres, and she felt the particular satisfaction of someone who has seen justice done not because justice is always done, but because in this specific case, with these specific people, the right things had happened and the right words had been heard. On a morning in October of 1879, she woke before dawn and lay in the dark for a long time with a certainty gathering in her that was new and enormous and entirely welcome. She told Grant at breakfast, directly, in the way she told him everything. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and looked at her with the full, unguarded warmth she had come to live inside, and his face did the thing it did when something moved him genuinely, went very still and very open at once, and he said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "Are you certain?" in a voice that was not quite steady. "I am very certain," she said. He came around the table, and he held her with his face in her hair, and she felt his heartbeat against her back, steady as it always was, steady as the fire in the sandstone canyon on a cold November morning. Their son was born in June of 1880, in the house they had rebuilt with their own hands, with Dora Finch in attendance, and the June morning making the windows white with light. They named him William James Ford, and he was a large, healthy baby with dark hair like his father and gray-green eyes that in the first weeks were the unfocused contemplative blue of all new babies, and resolved, by the end of summer, into a specific gray-green that Rebecca recognized as her own. William was not a peaceful baby. He was vigorous and opinionated, and made his views known with impressive volume. And Grant, who had seemed to Rebecca before parenthood to be a man of absolute equanimity, was revealed to have a specific capacity for being entirely undone by his son's smallest expressions. The first smile, the first reaching of tiny hands toward his father's face, the first moment of recognition when William turned toward Grant's voice across the room. Rebecca watched Grant with their son and thought that she had not known before that love could accumulate, that it could keep adding to itself, keep finding new things to be, that the man she had loved across a fire in a canyon could become a man she loved even more, holding the small, warm weight of their child. The winter of 1880 was a mild one, and they were settled enough by then that it was pleasant rather than arduous, the house warm and sound, the 40 acres yielding a modest but reliable operation, Grant working both the land and the blacksmith position in town, Rebecca at the telegraph office 3 days a week, and home the other 4 with William, and the steadily increasing satisfaction of a life that had been built deliberately and honestly on a foundation that held. Dora Finch became effectively William's grandmother, taking this role on with the same quiet competence with which she had sheltered Rebecca in those dangerous November days. And there were few evenings when she did not appear at the dinner table, and few Sunday mornings when she did not bring biscuits and the particular sharpness of her perspective on whatever was currently happening in Marlow Crossing, which was a great deal. Because the town was growing rapidly, and growth in a small place generates opinion at a corresponding rate. By the spring of 1882, the telegraph office had become a proper operation with 2 operators, and Rebecca had been asked by the county to serve as a consultant for the expanding wire network, a position that involved occasional travel to Amarillo and periodic correspondence with the federal office in Austin, and paid reasonably well, and satisfied the part of her that had always needed precise and meaningful work. Grant's blacksmith work had evolved with the town into something closer to a proper smithing enterprise, and he had taken on an apprentice named Marcus, a 17-year-old who had come to Marlow Crossing with his family from Alabama, and who had the particular combination of strength and patience and careful attention that the trade required, and that Grant recognized because it was close to his own. On a November morning, 2 years and almost exactly 1 day after the morning that had started everything, Rebecca stood on her front porch with a cup of coffee in her hands and watched Grant come up from the barn with William on his shoulders, the 2-year-old gripping his father's hair with cheerful indifference to the discomfort this caused. And Grant was talking to his son in the low voice he used for important matters, pointing at the horses in the field and naming them. And William was making sounds that were close enough to the right words to constitute clear improvement. The morning was cold in the clean November way, the air bright and sharp, the sky that particular hard autumn blue that existed before winter fully arrived. The range north of their property was gold and brown with late grass and frost, and the distance was clear all the way to the low line of the caprock in the far west. She thought about the morning 2 years ago, the gun in her hand, the fire in the canyon, the dark shapes of 2 riders against the dawn sky, the terrifying weight of the secret she had carried, and the terrifying relief of telling it to a stranger who turned out not to be a stranger at all. She thought about all the things that had happened because of that morning, the hearings and the trial and the reparations, the people whose land had been restored and whose losses had been acknowledged, the network of men who had used their power to steal from others now held accountable. She thought about Dora's steadiness and Pruitt's efficiency and Willis's loyalty, and even Aldrich's frightened cooperation, the whole complicated human machinery of a reckoning that had worked. And she thought about Grant, who had followed her tracks across frozen ground for no reason except that it was the right thing to do. She was pregnant again. She had known for 3 weeks and had told Grant 2 weeks ago, and they had received the news with the same quiet joy as the first time, as something they had hoped for and were grateful to have. Grant reached the porch step and looked up at her, and William said "Mama" with great authority and reached both arms toward her, and she took her son and settled him against her hip, and felt the solid, warm weight of him and the small flutter of new life inside her, and looked at her husband in the clear November morning. "Good morning," Grant said, and kissed her, and his mouth was cold from the outside air and warm underneath. "Good morning," she said against his mouth. William said something that sounded like approval. Grant took her coffee cup without asking and drank from it, which he had been doing since approximately their second week of knowing each other, and which she had stopped objecting to on the grounds that it was an endearing habit she had apparently decided to tolerate indefinitely. And they stood on the porch of the house they had built together in the town they had helped save in the life they had made from nothing more than a cold morning and a shared fire, and the decision to trust each other when everything said not to. The second child was born in April, a boy they named Henry Charles Ford, dark-haired and substantially louder than his brother had been at equivalent ages, which they had not thought possible and found to be the case. He was healthy and strong and arrived in the world with the complete conviction that it was waiting for him, which endeared him to his father immediately. William, now 3, was seriously interested in his brother for approximately 2 weeks before becoming primarily interested in the horses again, which was a preference everyone in the family respected. Marlow Crossing continued to grow, and Rebecca and Grant grew with it and in it, and the years that followed were good years, years of work and expansion and the ordinary extraordinary texture of a life lived well, with seasons and arguments and reconciliations, and the accumulation of small traditions that become the skeleton of a family's story. They had a third child when Rebecca was 32 and Grant was 36, a daughter this time, Frances Eleanor Ford, named for Rebecca's mother, and for a woman in a book Rebecca had loved since childhood. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's direct gray-green eyes, and from the first weeks it was apparent that she had strong opinions about everything, which her parents received as appropriate given her heritage. Dora Finch lived to see all 3 of them, which she considered her due, and Grant and Rebecca considered an unmixed blessing, and she was present at the kitchen table on the morning of the day that the final reparations payment arrived, the last official piece of the Southern Plains Railroad case, which closed the legal book on everything that had started in that November wagon fire. Rebecca held the official document and looked at it for a long time. "It is done," she said. Grant was reading the document over her shoulder, one hand on her back. "All of it," he said. She thought about the girl she had been in Philadelphia, precise and careful and alone, building a quiet life from good work, who had looked at numbers that told a story she had not wanted to know and had made the decision to know it anyway. She thought about the months of running, the fear and the loneliness, the burning wagon in the dark. She thought about the cold morning. She thought about what it meant that the right decision was sometimes the terrifying one, and that the person you needed was sometimes a stranger in a snowfield with his hands raised, and that trust, true trust, had to be built under pressure or it was not built at all. "Grant," she said. He said, still reading. "I am glad I did not shoot you." He looked up from the document and there was the smile, the one she knew completely, the warm, unguarded one that lived behind all that steadiness, the one that was specifically for her. "I am significantly glad of that as well," he said. She turned and kissed him, and the kitchen was warm and the document was on the table, and outside the window the Texas spring was doing its brief and spectacular work on the flat country, green coming up through the brown in long advancing lines, and the horses were in the field and their children were somewhere in the house, the oldest 2 pursuing some organized dispute that had been running for several days. The youngest asleep in her cradle with her small fists raised beside her head in the attitude of victory. And the fire that had started on a cold morning in November was still burning, had never stopped, had become the kind of fire that does not need tending because it has found its proper fuel and is settled into the deep, steady burn that needs no more coaxing, that gives warmth without being asked, that will burn for the length of a life and then some. It was not perfect. No life is. There were hard winters and hard arguments and hard decisions and grief, because grief does not leave anyone alone, not even the people who have found what they were looking for. There was the year the creek ran dry, and the year the cattle sickened, and the year Dora fell ill and frightened everyone before recovering, stubbornly, in the way she did everything. There were nights Grant went quiet in the way he sometimes did, gone into that interior country that held the things he had done and lost and grieved, and Rebecca had learned to sit beside him in those nights the way he had sat beside her in the alcove, while the blizzard roared, not solving, not demanding, just there. And there were the bright years, the ones that came back when she closed her eyes in any difficult moment, the spring evenings on the front porch, William and Henry racing each other across the yard, while Frances watched with the imperial composure of a younger sibling who has correctly identified herself as the most interesting person present. Grant's voice explaining something to one of the children with the patient thoroughness of a man who genuinely believes his children deserve complete information. The smell of the house she knew by heart, and the sound of the range in wind, and the particular quality of the Texas sky at the hour before dark when the whole enormous western hemisphere of it turned colors that belonged to no language yet invented. This was the life. This was what the cold morning had been pointing toward, though it had not known it and neither had they. Two people who had been alone and running, who had found a fire in a canyon and a secret that had to be shared, who had been frightened enough to be honest and close enough to the bone to mean it, who had trusted each other under circumstances that made trust feel like the bravest possible act, who had built something real from something dangerous and kept building long after the danger had passed. On the last warm evening of October, the year of the final reparations payment, Grant and Rebecca sat on their front porch in the last of the autumn light, and the children were inside, and Soldier, the gray gelding, now quite elderly and of great dignity, stood in the field and watched the sunset with the philosophical equanimity of a horse who has seen considerable things and is at peace with all of them. Rebecca was leaning against Grant's shoulder and his arm was around her and the light was failing slowly and beautifully over the western horizon. "Do you ever think about that morning?" she asked. "Every November," he said, "when the temperature gets to that particular cold." "I always think about it." "What do you think about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "That I am glad I followed the tracks," he said, "that it was the best decision I ever made without knowing it was a decision." She lifted her face to look at him. His profile against the fading light was as familiar to her as her own reflection and more beloved. "I thought about shooting you for a full 10 seconds, she said. "I know," he said. "I was watching the angle of the gun. And you were not frightened." "Terrified," he said simply, "but not of you, of missing the chance." She loved him so completely and so quietly, in the deep settled way that is only possible after years of choosing each other. And she thought about all the threads that had to be pulled through exactly the right needles for them to arrive here. The telegraph strips and the burning wagon and the frozen ground and the sandstone canyon, and the fire burning steady against the November dark. "I love you," she said, "because some things should be said out loud and often." "I love you," he said, and meant it the way he had said it the first time and every time without reservation, without the careful management of a man protecting himself, with all of it, his whole steady, generous heart. The October light faded and the stars came out, one by one and then all at once in the way of the Texas sky, spread above the flat country in their millions, cold and permanent and entirely indifferent to small human lives. And yet it was possible to be underneath that indifferent sky and feel held by it, to feel that the vastness was also a kind of company, and that a fire in a canyon and a shared secret had been enough, after everything, to build a whole bright life upon.